Chapter 5. Ashton Disappears. Ogilvy wanted me to protect Ashton and his family, so early next morning I was in the office making my plans. I went to Ogilvy and told him that the first thing I needed was a list of all the people Ashton was in contact with. Ogilvy smiled and pushed some papers across the desk. "It's all there, ready for you." In return, I gave him my list. "That's what I need," I said. He looked carefully at what I'd written. "What's this? 6 men? 6 cars? Radio telephones?" He stopped. "Who do you think we are? The CIA? Why do you need all these?" "I have to watch 3, perhaps 4 people, 24 hours a day." He stopped me. "Which 3 or 4 people?" "First Ashton and Penny Ashton, then Gillian Ashton, and Benson." "Why Benson?" Ogilvy demanded. "Well, the computer has them all, even Benson, kept under top secret. I put all the names through the computer until I lost them in level purple." "Okay, but you can't keep an eye on 4 people with 6 men. I'll let you have 8, and I'll arrange for Ashton's telephones to be tapped." He looked at the list again. "But what the devil do you need a gun for? Is it really essential?" "Well, Benson's carrying a gun in his pocket, and Ashton's got another under his arm. If they're expecting that kind of action, then we should be prepared." "Right. I give you permission to take 2 guns. Get your men together, and I want a tape recording of what you say to them." I called together all the men I wanted for my team and told them what they had to do. Larry, who shared my office, was one of them. It was going to be his first job in the field, away from the office. I took the tape recording back to Ogilvy. "I've got another question," he said. "Did you cancel a request made to Inspector Honister for copies of his reports on the Ashton case?" "Yes. It seemed to me a waste of time, especially if I'm going to be there watching Ashton. Honister wasn't very happy about it, and I think it's important to keep him happy. We want him to cooperate with us." "You're perfectly right, of course," said Ogilvy. "Except for one thing. This department did not request those copies. The request came from another department, and they're not very pleased that their request has been cancelled." "Oh," I said. "Who wanted the reports?" "Do you need to ask?" said Ogilvy sharply. "The gentleman you met yesterday is making sure he knows everything that happens. All right, Malcolm. Go and look after Ashton. But don't do anything without talking to me about it first. Is that agreed?" "Yes, I'll do that, sir." And I left his office. Driving back to Marlow, I explained to Larry Godwin more about what had happened. I told him that information about Ashton was locked up in level purple in the computer, and that I didn't have permission to see it. Larry was both angry and amazed. "It's so stupid," he interrupted. "You mean Ogilvy won't tell you what this business is all about?" "I don't think he's allowed to tell me anything. There was a top man from the government in his office when he spoke to me, obviously a man with a lot of power." "You mean Krieger?" he said. I glanced quickly at him. "Who?" "Lord Krieger. Short, fat man. I saw him coming out of Ogilvy's office when you were there yesterday. He got divorced last week. His picture was in the newspaper." "Do you know anything more about him?" I asked. "Not a thing." And he left me even more puzzled than before. When we arrived at the hospital, we met Inspector Honister in the car park. He looked a bit more cheerful than the day before. "We're making progress. I think we know the make of the car. A witness saw a dark blue Ford Cortina parked near Ashton's house on Saturday afternoon. I'm beginning to think we might find this man. I hope Gillian Ashton will be able to identify him when we get him." "She won't," I replied, shaking my head. "She's blind." Honister looked horrified and swore violently. "Wait till I catch this man. It'll be a real pleasure to send him to prison for a long, long time." While we were talking, Jack Brent, one of the other members of my team, came across. "Penny Ashton's inside the hospital, visiting Gillian," he said. "But there's something else you ought to know," he went on. "We can't find Ashton." "Isn't he at his office?" I asked sharply. "No, and he isn't at home. There's no sign of Benson either." "Come on, Larry, quick. We're going to Ashton's house. There may be nothing to worry about, but let's make sure. Jack, stay close to Penny Ashton. For God's sake, don't lose her." At Ashton's house, we found only one of the servants, Mary. She told us that Ashton's bed had not been slept in the previous night, and she hadn't seen him at all that day. I began to get worried, and rang the hospital to speak to Penny. "Did you tell your father about us last night?" "No. He'd gone to bed when I got in, and he'd gone out when I got up this morning. Why? What's the matter, Malcolm? Has something happened to him?" "I don't know if anything's happened, but I think you'd better come home now." "I'm coming at once," she replied, and put the phone down. I walked into Ashton's study. On his desk were two envelopes, one addressed to Penny, and the other to me. I picked up mine and opened it. "My dear Malcolm, you are too intelligent not to have understood what I have tried to say to you in our recent conversations. There is an old French saying, 'The man who finds a good son-in-law gains a son, but the man who finds a bad one loses a daughter. Marry Penny and make her happy, but for her sake, be a bad son-in-law. Yours, George Ashton." I sat down with a heavy feeling in my stomach, and the knowledge that we had made a bad job of looking after Ashton. Chapter 6. A Bad Son-in-Law? I rang Ogilvy and told him that Ashton and Benson had disappeared, and I read him Ashton's letter. "A bad son-in-law," said Ogilvy. "What the hell does he mean?" "I think he's saying that he's getting away from Penny in order to protect her," I said. "I wouldn't do what he wanted, marry her at once and take her away from him. So he's taken himself away from her. He must think she's in danger if she's with him." "I suppose you could be right, but it seems a bloody strange way to protect his daughter." "Does she know?" asked Ogilvy. "Not yet. She's on her way back from the hospital now. Ashton's left a note for her, too. If there's anything important in it, I'll let you know." "Think she'll tell you?" he asked. "Yes. The funny thing is, sir, that last night I did ask her to marry me, and she accepted. She was going to tell Ashton when she got home, but he'd already gone to bed. Maybe he'd already left. If he'd only waited another couple of hours, he might have decided not to go." "Well, don't blame yourself for that." There was a pause. "Does Penny know about your work for the department?" "No," I replied. "Well, she has to know, and now's the time to tell her. What I want you to do is to search the house very carefully. See if you can find anything that might show where Ashton has gone. If there's anything you don't understand, bring it back to the office. I think there's going to be a lot of trouble over this." I didn't look forward to explaining to Penny about my work and why we wanted to search her father's house. I had a feeling that our relationship was about to change for the worse. Just then, I heard Penny's Aston Martin sports car coming up the drive to the house. I met her as she ran to the door. Jack Brent's car was now coming up the drive. "There's a man following me," Penny cried, and then she noticed Larry Godwin in the hall. "What's happening? Malcolm, who are these men? What's happened to Daddy?" "As far as I know, he's all right," I said, and took her into her father's study. I picked up the letter. "You'd better read this." As she read the note, her face turned pale. "But I don't understand." "What does he say?" She gave me the letter and went over to the window, while I read, "My dearest Penny, for reasons which I cannot explain, I must go away for a while. I am not a criminal, and I have done nothing wrong. I do not know how long I shall be away, but please do not try to find me, and do not bring the police into this. My reasons are private. I shall be quite safe, because my old friend Benson will be looking after me. It would make me very happy if you would marry Malcolm as soon as possible. I know that you love him, and I think he is a very good man. I am sure that the two of you will be very happy together, and I am equally sure that you will both look after Gillian. Please forgive me for my sudden departure, but it is in the best interests of all of us. Your loving father, George." I looked up. "I'm sorry, Penny." "But I don't understand," she cried. "Oh, Malcolm, what's happened to him?" She came into my arms, and I held her close. "I don't know," I said. "But we'll find out." She was still for a while, but pushed me away as 2 cars arrived quickly. "Malcolm, who are all these men? Have you told the police? Daddy said not to." "No, I haven't told the police," I said quietly. "Sit down, Penny. I have a lot to tell you." I hesitated, not knowing best where to begin. "I told you I work for a company called McCulloch and Ross, and that's perfectly true. We do the work I told you about, and we do it very well. But the company is also a sort of secret government department, which deals with economic and industrial information if it is important to the state." "You mean you're some kind of spy?" "No, not a spy." "But you were watching my father like a common spy," she said angrily. "And was I just a means to an end? Did you get close to me just to learn more about my father?" "No." I looked her straight in the eyes. "I didn't know anything at all about your father until yesterday, and I don't know much more now." She looked at me coldly. "And these men in the hall, are they from your department too?" "Yes." "Then I'd like to talk to the man in charge. I knew something was worrying Daddy. Now I know where it was coming from." "You're talking to the man in charge, and you're wrong about your father," I said carefully. That stopped her, and she sat down suddenly. "You are in charge?" "That's right." "And you don't know what you're doing?" she said with a laugh of disbelief. "I know what I'm doing, but I don't know why. It's become very complicated. Let me tell you how I got into this." So I told her everything. I told her about Nellie the computer and the secret color levels. I told her about Ogilvy and Krieger. I told her much more than I should have told her. I told her how, after the acid attack on Gillian, I was told to watch and protect her father. "I've not done a very good job so far," I said, "but I'll find him." "You're not going after him? He said in his letter—" I interrupted her. "All I know is that your father is considered by some people to be a very important man. I don't know why, but he could be going into danger without realizing it. My job is still to find him and protect him. He's not in a position to do that properly himself." She started to cry, quietly at first, and the tears ran down her face. Then she began to tremble, as if she was suddenly very cold, and I put my arm around her. She held on to me tightly. When your safe, comfortable world seems to be falling apart, you need to hold on to somebody.
"Oh, Malcolm, what am I to do?"
"You must do what you think best. If you trust me, you'll help me to find him. But I couldn't blame you if you refuse. I haven't been open and honest with you. I should have told you all this yesterday."
"But you couldn't. You weren't allowed to." "Malcolm, what are your men waiting for?"
"For your decision. I want to search the house, and I can't do that without your permission." She came back to the desk and read her father's letter again. "He wrote to me too," I said, and gave her my letter. She read it slowly, then gave it back to me. "Bring in your men," she said, in a voice which had no expression or feeling in it. We found a number of surprising things in that house, but none of them seemed to be of any use to us. There was no clue to tell us where Ashton could have gone. In the cellar there was a very well-equipped laboratory, but none of us had any idea what sort of work Ashton had done there. Hidden behind a cupboard in Ashton's bedroom was a heavy steel door with a sort of lock you usually see only in banks. By measuring the walls, outside and inside the house, we discovered that there was a small, secret strong room there. So secret that not even Penny knew about it. While the other men were searching the house, Penny and I talked about her father's life. I asked her how long Benson had worked for the family.
"He's been with us since before I was born," she replied. "He used to work in one of Daddy's factories, but he visited us at least once a week. Then when we came to live in this big house, he came to live here and work as Daddy's personal servant."
We were still talking when Peter Michaelis, one of my searchers, came in to report that they'd found nothing useful, but that in a room upstairs there was the biggest model railway he had ever seen. I didn't believe him, and forgot all about it, because Ogilvy rang to tell me to come back to the office as quickly as possible. I explained about the secret strong room and the laboratory, and he promised to send some experts immediately to examine everything. Before I left, I looked for Michaelis and found him with a model railway. "You haven't time to play with that," I said angrily. "We're here on business to find out about Ashton." Michaelis smiled. "This is business. To search this place thoroughly, we'll have to look inside every piece of this railway set. The whole thing is so big that we have to use the controls to bring everything back to this central point." I looked at the railway more carefully. It was very big and very complicated, all controlled from a central desk. There must have been about 2 kilometers of railway line, but Michaelis seemed to know how to work the controls, so I left him to search the 1,000 different pieces of equipment, and went downstairs. Penny was waiting for me, her eyes flashing with anger.
"Someone has been searching my room."
"I know," I replied. "All the rooms in the house have been searched." "I think you could have trusted me," she said icily. "It's not a question of trust," I tried to explain. "I do my job in the way I was taught. I have to go by the book."
"Then it's not the kind of book I'd want to read," she exploded,
and we had our first big quarrel. Chapter 7. Ashton and the Russian Scientist. I was not in the best of tempers when I met Ogilvy back in the office an hour later. All I could tell him was that Ashton had obviously been prepared for escape for a long time. He had been frightened of something, and had made his plans carefully, ready to be put into operation at any moment. Ogilvy had another problem. I had a meeting this afternoon with the minister and people from other departments. It wasn't easy. There are other people who don't want our department to be in charge of Ashton's case. Lord Krieger, for example? I asked. How did you recognize him? He gets his photograph in the papers, I replied. Well, his interest in Ashton goes back a long time. Before this department started, Ashton was dealt with by Krieger's department. Krieger badly wants to take Ashton's case away from us. However, today the minister decided that Ashton was still our case, and so it's still our job to find him. That means it's your job, Malcolm. I need permission to see level purple in the computer. Not possible. Don't be stupid, I replied angrily. How can I look for a man if I don't know anything about him? Either I get to see level purple tomorrow, or I resign. You're always in too much of a hurry, Malcolm. To begin with, I couldn't get permission for you to see level purple by tomorrow. And in any case, Ashton isn't in level purple. He's in level black. And you couldn't get permission to see level black in less than 3 months. That's it, then, I said. I'd better go along to my office and type my resignation. Don't be a young fool, Ogilvy said sharply. He thought for a long minute, drumming his fingers on the desk. Suddenly, he said, I've made up my mind. But if anyone ever knows of this, I could lose my job. Wait here. He went through a door at the back of his office, was away for several minutes, and then returned. Come in here. I followed him into a small room where there was a computer screen. I've opened level black for you, he said. You must read about Ashton and only Ashton. There are other things in level black which are better for you not to know. You have my word. He nodded and left, closing the door behind him. I looked at the computer screen. On it was a message. No written notes to be made of anything in level black. I sighed and started to read about George Ashton's life, which had been a very full one. Alexander Chelyuskin was born near Novgorod in Russia in 1919. At the age of 12, he was such a good student that he was sent to a special school in Moscow, where he made excellent progress, especially in mathematics. In 1936, he came under the influence of Peter Kapitsa, a brilliant Russian physicist who had studied for some years in England. Kapitsa changed the direction of Chelyuskin's studies from mathematics to physics, and Chelyuskin later played an important part in improving the quality of Russian weapons in the war of 1939–45. In March 1945, when the Russians discovered that the Americans had developed the atomic bomb, Chelyuskin was told to work on the development of a similar bomb for Russia. After the war finished in 1945, Chelyuskin became dissatisfied because he had to go on working on research into weapons, and he did not like what he was doing. He began to think about people, not physics and mathematics. He decided that he did not like Russian society and the direction which Russia was following after the war. He decided to kill himself, but without actually dying. He made a careful and complicated plan, and 3 months later it was reported that he had died in a fire. The burnt body of a man was certainly found after the fire, but it was not Chelyuskin's. So, at the age of 28, Chelyuskin arrived secretly in England. Unfortunately for the English, who had hoped to learn about Russian secrets from him, Chelyuskin refused to talk about his work on atomic weapons. He did not want to work as a scientist for the British government. What he wanted to do was to live in England as an ordinary citizen. The government officials and scientists who had been looking forward to his ideas could not understand him. But finally, he got what he had asked for. He did almost exactly the same as he had done in Russia. He took another man's identity, this time an English soldier who had died in a traffic accident. Chelyuskin was taught to speak English, and when he finally took the place of the George Ashton who had died, he was able to live successfully as a member of English society. It was a strange new world for George Ashton. At first, he took a job in a shop, but this quickly bored him. He had been given some money to help him in his new life, and soon he started a business with a man whom he met at work. John Franklin was good at working with his hands. George Ashton was good at using his brains, and their business did well. Ashton married Franklin's daughter, Mary, and they had 2 daughters, Penelope and Gillian. 2 years later, Mary Franklin died, and Ashton looked after the 2 girls. At the same time, he worked hard to develop new chemical materials for industry, which gradually made him very rich. All this time, people from the British Secret Service were watching carefully to see if the man from Russia would do something extraordinary with his brilliant scientific mind. But Ashton concentrated on his business, and gradually the officials from the government lost interest in what he was doing. Ashton became more and more successful in industry, but no one paid much attention until I had sounded the alarm by my careless questions to the computer. Until then, the life of George Ashton, previously Alexander Chelyuskin, my future father-in-law, had run very smoothly in England. When I finished, I had been sitting in front of the computer screen for 2.5 hours, and I had a headache. I went back to Ogilvy's office, where he offered me a glass of whisky, and we sat down to talk about what I'd seen. "What do you think?" he began. "I think George Ashton is one hell of a man. I'm proud to have known him," I replied. "Anything else?" "Yes," I said. "One fact. There's been a big change in the kind of scientific work Ashton has done in England. It's all technical. He's been applying his own earlier ideas to developing new materials. But that isn't the type of person he was before. He was a man who thought up new ideas. Everything he did, all of his training was in that direction. Did he just give it up when he came to England? Or has he been applying his mind to something that we don't know anything about?" "You're not too stupid," said Ogilvy. "You're probably right. You can't stop a man thinking. But how can you find out what he's been thinking about?" "Do we know what books he buys? What scientific magazines he reads?" I asked. "Yes. He keeps up to date only in the type of chemistry that is important to his business. Nothing else." We sat for a few minutes in silence, and then I asked, "What does Krieger have to do with Ashton?" "It was his department that helped Ashton escape from Russia after the war. Krieger himself went into Russia to bring him out. Krieger wasn't Lord Krieger then. His name was Paulton. Now he's head of his department. When Ashton became an ordinary businessman instead of a scientist with lots of valuable secrets, his records were moved to our department, and Krieger was very annoyed. He always thought that Ashton might do something scientifically useful one day. Although Krieger brought Ashton out of Russia, Ashton never really liked him, and certainly didn't trust him. That's probably why Krieger's interfering now. He's sure that Ashton has useful ideas that he's hiding from everybody. "Is there any news of Ashton?" I asked. "None at all. We've got people watching the airports and the ports, all the usual things," replied Ogilvy. "We must find him. And I want to find the man who threw the acid into Gillian Ashton's face and frightened Ashton so much that he ran away to protect his children from any more attacks." The next day brought little progress. Penny wouldn't speak to me after our quarrel about the search of her room, and nobody had seen Ashton or Benson at any of the airports or seaports. At 3 o'clock, Ogilvy rang me to say that they expected to unlock the strong room at Ashton's house later that afternoon. "I want you to be there. Listen carefully. When the door is finally opened, only you and the man working on the lock will be present. As soon as the door is opened, you send him out of the room and check what is inside the strong room. If the contents can be moved, you bring them here. If they can't be moved, you close and lock the door again. No one else must see what is in that room. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear," I replied. When I arrived at the Ashtons' house once again, I met Lord Krieger in the hall. He did not look pleased to see me.
"Ah, Mr. Jaggard, I understand there is a strong room here. Has it been opened yet?"
I wondered where he got his information, but answered, "No, not yet."
Good. Then I am in time," said Lord Krieger.
I said, "Am I to understand that you wish to be present when the room is opened?"
"That's correct,"
he replied. "I'm afraid that will not be possible." He looked at me thoughtfully.
"Do you know who I am?"
"Yes, my lord. I have instructions that nobody except myself is to be present when the door is opened." His eyes opened wide with surprise and anger.
"Did Ogilvy say that?"
"Those were his instructions to me. I don't know if he was thinking of you, my lord. Do you wish to speak to him? There is a telephone in the study."
"Yes," he replied. "I'd better speak to Ogilvy myself."
He went off to the study, and I went over to the window and looked out at the garden. A few minutes later, Krieger came out of the study, looking very angry. He left the house, got into his car, and drove quickly away. The phone rang. It was Ogilvy. "Krieger must not be allowed into that strong room, and he mustn't know what is inside." "He won't," I replied. "He's gone. We're just about to open the door."
"Let me know what you find," he said.
I went up to Ashton's bedroom.
"There you are," said the man who was working on the door. "You can open it now."
"I'll have to ask you to leave now, Frank," I told him. He went out and closed the bedroom door behind him. I opened the door to the strong room. Ogilvy's mouth fell open.
"Empty?"
"Absolutely," I replied. "There wasn't a thing in that room. It looks as though it's never been used since it was first built."
"Who else knows about this?" he asked.
"No one. Only you and I."
"That's a pity. Krieger will never believe me when I tell him. Perhaps I should have let him stay with you."
I didn't care what Krieger believed or did not believe, but Ogilvy warned me to be careful.
"Krieger is a bad man to have as an enemy.
He didn't like the way you treated him today."
"He didn't show it.
He seemed pleasant enough," I replied.
"That's his way," said Ogilvy.
"Always polite and pleasant. But don't trust him." Chapter 8. The Man Who Threw the Acid. After that, nothing happened for a while. The search for Ashton and Benson continued, but with no success. The day after we opened the strong room, I rang Penny.
"Is this to tell me you found Daddy?" she asked.
"No, I've got no news about him. I'm sorry."
"Then I don't think we've much to talk about, Malcolm," she said, and rang off. Gillian was still in hospital, and I went to visit her. The doctors said there was a chance that she might recover some of the sight of her left eye, but she would never see with her right eye again. When I talked with Gillian, she wanted to know what had gone wrong between Penny and me. "Nothing," I said lightly. "Did she say there was anything wrong?" "No, but she stopped talking about you, and when I asked, she said she hadn't seen you."
"We've both been very busy," I said. I changed the subject, and we talked about other things. Afterwards, I spoke to Peter Michaelis, who was the member of my team with the job of protecting her. He found the job boring, but told me he'd tried to help Gillian by reading to her every afternoon. He was a kind man, and he and Gillian had become quite friendly. When we talked about Ashton, Michaelis said that the most interesting thing he had seen in the house had been the model railway, by far the largest he had ever seen.
"He's got copies of all the old railway timetables, and the system runs to time. It's very complicated, so he's got a computer, and he's managed to program the whole timetable on it. It's wonderful. The whole thing works automatically."
That sounded like Ashton. Find the most efficient way to do something. However, his railway system was not helping me to find him, so I left Michaelis and went back to London. 2 weeks after Ashton had disappeared, Honister rang me. "We've got a suspect, a man in London. He hired a car for the weekend when Miss Ashton was attacked. The owner of the car hire firm told one of our men that acid had been spilt on the back seat." "What's the man's name? Has he said anything yet?" I demanded. "His name's Maybury. One of the men from Scotland Yard is going to see him this evening. He's an Inspector Crammond." "I'll ring him at once. I want to be there to make sure they aren't too bloody soft with him." I met Crammond that evening, and we went to Finsbury in North London, where Maybury lived in a small flat. "He doesn't sound like a violent man," said Crammond. "The woman who owns the house describes him as very quiet, always reading, and he goes to church twice on Sundays." I felt disappointed. This sounded less and less like our man. We went up to the flat and knocked on the door. A man in his 40s with a pale, unhealthy skin opened the door. "Mr. Peter Maybury," said Crammond. "Yes," came the reply. "We're police officers," said Crammond pleasantly. "We think you can help us. Can we come in?" "I suppose so. How can I help you?" he asked coldly. It wasn't a very luxurious flat. The furniture was either old or cheap, but it was clean and tidy. On one wall there was a shelf with 40 or 50 books on it. I looked at them. Some were about religion, some were about the protection of the world from scientific progress, others were ordinary stories. Crammond started by asking to see Maybury's driving license. "I don't have a car," replied Maybury. "That wasn't what I asked," said Crammond. "Can I see your license, please?" Maybury took his license out of his jacket pocket and handed it over. Crammond examined it carefully and passed it to me. "When did you last drive a car, Mr. Maybury?" asked Crammond. Maybury said, "Look, if anyone says I've been in an accident, they're wrong, because I haven't." He seemed nervous. "Do you ever hire a car?" continued Crammond. "I have done." "Recently?" "No, not for some months," replied Maybury. "Supposing I said that you hired a car in Slough 2 weekends ago, What would you say? Asked Crammond.
I'd say you were wrong, replied Maybury quietly.
Where were you that weekend?
Here, as usual. You can ask Mrs. Jackson downstairs.
Crammond looked at him for a moment. Mrs. Jackson was away that weekend. Did anyone see you? Did you go to church?
No, I didn't feel well.
Crammond spoke more strongly. Mr. Maybury, I suggest that you are telling me lies. I think that on Saturday morning you went to Slough by train and you hired a Ford Cortina car from Jolliffe's garage. Mr. Jolliffe was very angry about the acid damage to the back seat of the car. Where did you buy the acid?
I bought no acid, said Maybury.
But you hired the car. You gave your name and address to Mr. Jolliffe.
No,
repeated Maybury. Well, said Inspector Crammond, we can easily check that. We have the fingerprints from the car. I'm sure you won't mind coming to the police station so that we can compare yours with those from the car. This was the first I had heard of fingerprints, and I was not sure that Crammond really had any, but it worried Maybury.
I don't have to give you my fingerprints. I want you to leave, or I'll—
Send for the police, said Crammond. When did you first meet Miss Ashton? He went on suddenly.
I've never met her, said Maybury quickly.
Too quickly. But you know of her, insisted Crammond. Maybury was very nervous now. He took a step backwards and bumped into the table, knocking a book onto the floor. I picked it up and looked at the front. A report on developments in genetics. Suddenly, a number of puzzling facts began to make sense to me. Maybury's basic religious ideas, his interest in protecting the world from modern science, and what I knew about the work Penny Ashton was doing. I said, Mr. Maybury, what do you think of what is happening in modern biological science? Crammond looked very surprised. Maybury turned to look at me.
It's bad, he said. Very bad.
In what way? I asked.
The biologists are breaking the laws of God, cried Maybury. They are creating new forms of life, life that is not in the Bible, life that was not made by God.
Maybury was becoming more and more excited now.
She's godless. She's destroying the work of God and making monsters.
I had difficulty in keeping my voice calm. I suppose that by she, you mean Dr. Penelope Ashton. Crammond looked very puzzled by now. The change of direction in the conversation had left him behind. Maybury, now in a state of extreme nervous excitement, said thoughtlessly,
Among others?
Such as Professor Lumsden, I replied.
He's her boss, her devil.
If you thought she was doing wrong, why didn't you talk to her about it? Perhaps you could have made her change her mind, see things your way, I asked.
She would never have listened to me, and I wouldn't want to talk to her, said Maybury.
Crammond realized what was happening. Mr. Maybury, he said, are you admitting that you threw acid into the face of a woman called Ashton? Maybury had a hunted look on his face now, as he realized that he had said too much.
I haven't said that.
You've said enough. Crammond turned to me. I think we have enough information now to take him to the police station. I nodded, then said to Maybury, You're a religious man. You go to church every Sunday, twice, I'm told. Do you think it was a good action to throw acid into the face of a young woman?
I am not responsible to you for my actions, said Maybury. I am responsible only to God.
And may God help you, I said. because you got the wrong girl. You threw the acid in the face of Dr. Ashton's sister, who was coming home from church." Maybury stared at me. The confident expression on his face now changed to an expression of absolute horror. He whispered, "The wrong. Suddenly, a kind of horror overcame him. His whole body shook, and he screamed at the top of his voice before falling heavily to the floor, unconscious. "Oh, damn," said Crammond as the policeman waiting outside burst into the room. "He'll never go to prison now." Maybury was now lying on the floor, crying and making noises which neither Crammond nor I could understand. "He's mad. Phone for an ambulance," said Crammond. "We'll not get any more sensible answers out of him." Chapter 9. Lord Krieger again. Next morning I told Ogilvy about Maybury. He found it difficult to believe, and asked lots of questions. "Did he throw the acid just because he thought she was doing something wrong? Are you sure? Could someone else have told him to do it? Why did he choose Dr. Ashton?" Ogilvy's questions came like bullets from a gun. "We can't be absolutely sure," I replied. "The man's completely mad now, and I don't think we'll ever learn much more from him." "Damn it, Malcolm. The whole thing doesn't make sense. If this bloody fool chose a scientist by chance, and then threw the acid in the face of the wrong girl, why did Ashton run away?" I had no answer to that. We seemed to have made no progress at all in the search for George Ashton. I went along to the university to tell Penny. She was with Lumsden, her boss, but took me to her own office. Her manner to me was cool. "What do you want here, Malcolm?" she said. "Have you found Daddy?" I shook my head. "We found the man who threw the acid," I said. "Oh." She sat down at her desk. "Who is he?" "A man called Peter Maybury. He works in an office in London. He's also a very religious man." She frowned, then said, "But whatever could he have to do with Gillian?" I sat down. "I'm sorry, Penny. I didn't want to tell you this, but you have to know. The acid wasn't intended for Gillian. It was intended for you." "For me?" She shook her head as if she couldn't believe what I had said. "Why on earth should a man like that want to attack me? Why me?" "He seemed to think that you were interfering with the laws of God." Suddenly she realized the full meaning of what I had said. "Oh, my God!" she cried. "Poor Gillian!" Her body began to shake, and her head fell forward across her desk. She began to cry loudly. I got her a glass of water, but there wasn't much I could do until she had got over the first shock. I put my arm round her and said, "Here, drink this." She raised her head and cried, "Oh, Gillian, she'd be all right if I hadn't. Oh, Malcolm, what am I to do?" "Do? There's nothing you can do. You carry on as usual," I said firmly. "I don't see how I can do that. Not after this." I spoke carefully. "You can't blame yourself for what happened. You mustn't think that you're responsible for the actions of someone who's crazy." "Oh, I wish it had been me," she cried. "No, you mustn't ever say or think that. Now, you've got to think clearly, because I need your help. I need to ask you and your boss some questions." She nodded sadly and went to wash her face while I called Professor Lumsden. When he came in, He looked at Penny's white face and red eyes. "What's happened here? And who are you?" he asked in a shocked voice. "I'm Malcolm Jaggard, and I'm a sort of police officer. I'm also engaged to Penny. We're going to be married." Lumsden looked very surprised. "Oh, I didn't know about that." "You know, of course, about the recent attack on Penny's sister." "Yes, a most terrible thing." I told him about Maybury, and a worried look came over his face. "This is bad," he said. "I'm deeply sorry, Penny." "Can you tell me something about your work here, Professor?" I said. "In a way, this crazy man is right," he said. "We've discovered ways of isolating some of the thousands of genes in the seeds of plants and animals. Then we try to transfer them. It can be very dangerous, but if it works, it will help to produce more and better food in the world. But we are very, very careful. It's terribly important that these new bacteria can't escape from the laboratory until we are absolutely sure they're safe. Some people think we're doing wrong, because it's dangerous. Others, like your Maybury, have religious reasons for wanting to stop us." I could see that Professor Lumsden had nothing to tell me that would help me find George Ashton. Penny was still very shocked and upset, so I drove her home. Weeks and then months went by. The police and my department looked very carefully into Maybury's life and decided that he really was mad. It had been his own idea to throw the acid, and no one else had sent him. His attack had absolutely no connection with George Ashton, which left us with a big problem. Why had Ashton run away? It didn't make sense. My relationship with Penny improved, although neither of us referred to marriage. Gillian's condition improved a little, and the doctors managed to save about a quarter of her eyesight. She was able to leave the hospital and live at home. She and Penny began to make plans to go to the United States, where the doctors would try to repair the damage to her face. One evening, when Penny and I were having dinner, she said, "Do you remember you once talked about someone called Lord Krieger?" "Yes, that's right. Why?" "He's been seeing my boss, Professor Lumsden." That caught my interest. "Was it anything to do with Maybury?" I asked. "No," replied Penny. "The first time he came was just after you opened the strong room in our house." Something seemed wrong to me. Why had Krieger been seeing Lumsden before we knew about Maybury? Was there a connection between Ashton and Lumsden that we had missed?